Welcome to Leaders Up Close and Personal. My name is Tim Kotnour and I'm Director of the Engineering Leadership Institute. This program is brought to you by Duke Energy, and today, real privilege and honor to have John Elnitsky, who is with Duke Energy, Senior Vice President. So John, thank you for being here and giving us some time and sharing your stories with us.
Thank you, Tim. Glad to be here.
And so, John, I've heard about your career and you've shared stories with our students. And one of the things you talked about is, hey, throughout your career, you've been hired, you've been brought in to solve the big challenges, the big projects. Why do you think they called you? What did you bring to the table in solving those big challenges?
Well, Tim, I think it's a couple of things, but I would start with this, I call it a calm sense of detachment. I mean, to some extent, in any crisis, you need somebody that can come in and sort of step back and say, all right, let's organize, let's breathe for a minute, let's put the right steps in place to understand what really is the problem, pay that attention to detail I was talking about, get down to the facts, and then really just get organized. At the end of the day, you got to solve the problem. But I think my Navy training, my Navy background put me in a good position to be able to step into sort of a crisis and say, all right, how do we get organized? How do we go solve this?
Okay, so calm sense of detachment, be organized, be disciplined, get things done. Got it.
Yes, sir.
So what about John allows you to have that calm sense of detachment?
Well, I think it comes from my experience in the Navy. I think we had a lot of opportunities at a very early age, early in my career, to get involved with some tough problems. And I was fortunate enough to have leaders and mentors that said, hey, go figure this one out. Go solve this thing. Go bring the team together that you need to go fix it. And that has then translated in the ability, I think, to replicate that now on a bigger scale with bigger problems. But again, I think it's that sense of sometimes you just got to step back and think a little bit. I think a lot of times as organizations want to jump to, all right, we got to go solve, we got to go, and you do. I mean, you have to stop, you got to take the right immediate actions, get things into a safe condition, but then you got to sort of pause for a minute and think about, all right, how do we solve this on a bigger scale and get this project or this effort back on track?
As you were working through these big challenges and projects,
Yeah.
you probably had some engineering skills, management skills, leadership skills.
Yeah.
Did you have to use all three? How did you balance those?
I think you use all three throughout your career, whether you're solving a problem or not. You know, as we talked about with the students, I'm a big believer that, you know, every one of us has those leadership, management, technical or engineering skills, and then some core team skills of how they work together. And I think all that happens over your course of a career, whether you're a new engineer coming out of college or someone like me who's running big engineering organizations, the shape of those changes a little bit. You know, how much. So when I started out, I would argue it was all about engineering, a little bit about leadership and management. Now, sort of the other end of the spectrum, but you still have that core need to understand the facts, understand the details, understand the engineering basis behind the problem you're trying to solve, and then bring a solution to it.
And maybe some of that discipline and rigor of engineering as well to these problems.
Well, as I told the students, and I'm convinced engineers make the best leaders, and I'm sticking to my story, and I'm biased, obviously, but I think part of that comes from that discipline that students learn in engineering programs. There's a certain element of logic, fact-based analysis, getting to solutions, figuring out what the risks are, what margin they need to establish to make sure they can protect people and the environment. And I think those serve you well then when you transition into a part of your career where now it's more about leadership and management and maybe a little less about engineering, but those common skills are still there.
Right. Hey, so with those common skills of engineering, I know we teach them, and the students obviously learn them. Can a student learn how to be a leader, or are they all born as leaders?
Oh, I think you definitely learn. I really challenge whether anybody's actually born as a leader. I think people have, different individuals maybe have a different ability to relate to people more easily. Maybe they more naturally have people gel around them and follow. But I think some of those common skills that you need to be good at leadership, you can learn. And I think you'll learn them along the way, whether they're, you know, how do I really get in, what amount of detail do I need to understand? How do I go walk the field and understand what the real problem is? Or how do I keep my perspective when maybe everything's burning down around me? How do I figure out how to drive to a solution? And all the time while I'm doing that, kind of keep, you know, a sense of perspective of self and a sense of humor as you're doing it.
So do you still walk the field?
I still walk the field, you bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I I've found no matter what the problem is, no matter how many emails, posts you've gotten on, how many pictures people have sent you, until you get out there and you look at it, you really can't understand necessarily the complexity or the scope of the problem. I mean, we spent a lot of time over this last year, as an example, taking some of our company's senior leadership out to the field to sort of see, hey, here's what we're dealing with, here's what the problems are. We're going to close ash basins across our system, across the company, getting our senior leaders out and say, hey, look, this is the scope. Until you can see that and you can actually go walk that space and go see the problem, I don't think you ever really quite understand or grasp the problem.
Right. So how do you're a leader, a lot of folks working for you, a big budget, I'm sure, and your day is packed. How do you manage your day to allow you to walk in the field, right? There's probably 1 or 2 meetings a day you got to go to, right? So how do you manage your day to?
Well, as I was telling some of the students, I think one of the keys is, from a time management perspective, I force myself to write down, hey, what am I going to do as a minimum today? What are the 2 or 3 things I'm going to get done? Mm-hmm. Now, the reality of it, Tim, a lot of times they don't get done. Right. But it's that, having a plan and trying to stick to that and trying to get some key things done each day, I think is important. Because if you don't do that, you're going to spend your whole day in sort of that quadrant 1 of Covey's thing, crisis management, right? You never get to the important stuff that's not urgent. You're doing all the urgent stuff. So you really got to sort of force yourself into that area. And as I was telling the students, I think spending some time each day, you carve out just to think. Mm-hmm. Not to multitask, not to answer email, not to listen to radio or watch TV, just to carve it out and pause and think about, how am I going to really change things going forward?
So how do you carve out your time to think?
Well, I'm fortunate, or maybe unfortunate, depending on your perspective. I've got a little bit of time each day that I got to drive to work. And maybe by plan or by unintended consequence, I've sort of lived far enough away that I've got a 30-minute or 35-minute commute. And I like to use that time to sort of just put it all in context. On the way in, what are the big things I really want to get done today if I can? And on the way home, sort of like digest the events of the day and, hey, there's some big things I've got to get done. I drive my admin crazy sometimes because on the way home I'll call and leave her a message. Hey, I had this great idea. You need to write this down and remind me tomorrow, so we go get on it. But I find that helps. I mean, so however you do it, whether it's during your commute or it's just carving out some time at lunch, pushing away from that computer, getting out and just getting away from the immediate problems, walking the space a little bit, is an important thing to do.
So it sounds like both on the big challenges, big projects, as well as the daily life, discipline, rigor, and calmness.
Yeah.
That's the secret.
I think so. And don't take yourself too serious in the whole process. I think sometimes we forget about that. I had a boss when I was executive officer in the Tucson that used to say, if you can't have a little panache and a little fun, what's the point? And I think it's important to remember that. I think teams are stronger when they see that the leader has fun and can take the time to have some fun, can poke at himself when he makes a mistake maybe and say, boy, what the heck was I thinking? I've seen you do that even with your students. Hey, I forgot to watch the clock. Yeah. So I think you got to keep that sort of sense of perspective about yourself as well.
So where's John's ego?
Well, I hope it's at the door most of the time. I think it's important to try to get your folks comfortable with coming and talking to you. You're not going to have engaged employees and people that are willing to challenge you if they think, hey, it's all about John or it's all about him doing something. And that can be a challenge sometimes. I mean, because people will perceive whether or not you have an ego or not, they feel, well, gee, this guy's got a lot of big stuff to do. I can't go worry him with this little problem. And I always try to make people comfortable or joke about it a little bit. I routinely, when people call me and I pick up the phone, I'll say, this is John Elnitsky. I'm standing at attention at my desk. Just to kind of, get a, hey, you've got my attention. I'm focused on what you're doing.
Okay. So calmness, check ego at the door. Is there some core that you hold to that helps drive those two things?
One of the big things I like to focus on with my folks is this idea. I call it forceful backup. And making sure that my organizations or my teams feel like they can walk in, whether it was when I was in command of a ship or in the jobs I'm in now, they can walk into my office or into my stateroom and say, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. And to get to the point where people feel comfortable with that. Now, that is not easy, and it takes some time to work at that. I always tell the story about when I first went into command. I was very concerned because, literally you're the old man. You're the 40-year-old and everybody else is at 19, 20, 21. And how do you get those guys not to be afraid to tell you when something's going wrong? And I would walk into the control room and I would give an order that was totally wrong. And I would wait for the watchstanders to say something. And when I first started doing that, no one would speak up. It was a little interesting why that happened. So the young guys, not surprisingly, would say, well, you know, you're the skipper, you're the boss, you're the senior VP, you know everything. Well, no, number one, and you may know something I don't, or you see something I don't. A little bit more scary was the more senior enlisted men or senior folks in your organization that say, well, I didn't really think you'd do it. I said, well, how do you know? How do you know I have the same information that you have? So unless you can build that relationship with your folks where they're not afraid to speak up, where they're not afraid to say, hey, I really don't get it. I really don't understand why you're doing what you're doing. I think you do run the risk of getting arrogant, maybe, thinking that you've got all the answers, thinking that you know, and in fact you won't.
Right. So you were hired big challenges because you brought calmness, discipline, collaboration, a sense of maybe servant leader.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's part of what you do. I mean, I think the job of any leader is to enable their people to be successful. It's literally about removing barriers. And I routinely will ask folks in a meeting or in a work effort that we're doing, so what do you need me to do? What do you need me to do to get out? What do I have to get out of the way for you so you can go accomplish this? Right. And it's funny, I had a guy just yesterday, as a matter of fact, walk into my office and say, hey, thanks for approving that invoice that I needed to get done. I'm like, why are you thanking me? That's my job. I mean, my job is to help you be successful. I said, you should never be afraid to come in and say, hey, John, I need some help. I can't get this thing going. It's stuck. I need to get it out of the way. So I do think our job as leaders is to make sure we enable our folks to be successful.
One last question.
Yes, sir.
The role of engineers is to
keep people safe.
Keep people safe.
I think they need to remember that. That's what it's all about. They manage risk every day, keep people safe, keep our environment safe.
John, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, wisdom, and energy with us.
Thanks, Tim. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. This has been Leaders Up Close and Personal.